All right, great. So that's about all the Spanish you'll get out of me tonight because I've forgotten too much of it. But what I would like to talk about is what I consider a neglected aspect of St. Ignatius' spirituality and the spiritual exercises. And I already previewed what I was going to talk about in the homily at the beginning, that the three traditional pillars of Christian living and of asceticism are prayer, fasting, almsgiving. And of course, we focus on these in a particular way during Lent, but these are the things that the early monks of the church came back to again and again as being the core of Christian life. And so what was I going to say here? So we've got those three things. And what's a little bit less known is that Ignatius actually has instructions or rules for all of these three things. Of course, the spiritual exercises are a school of prayer. But also he has rules for eating in the spiritual exercises where he gives instructions on how to order one's appetites for the glory of God. And that actually is a pretty nice general rule of thumb. You can take that as a template and kind of generalize it to pretty much any other kind of use of temporal goods. But then he dedicates a particular set of rules to the distribution of alms, to what to do with money. And I'd like to focus just on this pillar today. All right. So Ignatius actually attaches 8 rules. Let me see if I don't know why those are in there twice. But Ignatius actually dedicates 8 rules of spiritual exercises to this theme. And he puts them as an appendix, sort of at the end, so you can so that the retreat director can give them to the retreatant on a need-to-know basis. And the reason he puts them there is that he expects that some people who make the exercises will have disposable income, and he expects that, he knows that Jesus talks about our relationship to money as being one of the key obstacles to discipleship, right? Money is one of the things that we easily become attached to, and it's one of the things that keeps people from being entirely generous to God, is their fear about what will happen to them financially, the fear of the loss of status that being very generous with their money will entail. But he also knows that true conversion is never just a matter of feelings, it's never just a matter of interior movements and sentiments, but that when conversion is authentic, it always touches concrete realities, right? It touches the way we eat, it touches the way we spend our money, what our budget looks like for our month, it touches all those things. And that's really, for him, the fruit of the exercise. It isn't just that we have moving experiences of Jesus and feel close to him, but that it's through those moving experiences we gain the courage and the perspective to put our life in order. And the word order comes up again and again. For the very purpose of the exercise at the very beginning, he says, spiritual exercises are like walking and running and so forth, and just as we, do these, so also we can do spiritual exercises so as to overcome our disordered attachments, right? So as to put things in order. Right? And this is one of the areas of order that he thinks that most people are going to have to grapple with in their life. All right, and because he knows this is the case, he wants to have some guidelines handy. Now, so not all of the rules for giving alms are equally interesting, but I find a few of them pretty instructive and are very, very generally applicable. So we're going to go through some of the more generally applicable ones, and I'm going to group these into three subheadings. Okay, so the first is a rule about a balance to be struck. And the second, I'm going to go through 3 models of informing our conscience about money. So three models of bringing our mentality closer to the Gospel's mentality about the place of money and its usefulness or lack of usefulness in terms of discipleship. All right, and then finally, we're going to look at a couple different scenarios for honing discernment. imaginative exercises that help us attain the right perspective within which we can make ordered decisions. Right. Right, and I'd like to say also this. The rules. I mean, these rules are not so much publicized because they're kind of challenging. I think that's one of them. But I would say that there's a kind of organic link. Like, a lot of people are surprised to find them here in the exercises. But I think Ignatius thinks that, that prayer, fasting, almsgiving, there's a bond between all of them, and they kind of stand or fall together in a certain sense. And in particular, I think the relationship between prayer and almsgiving is one of reciprocal influence. So they kind of influence each other in the sense that by praying, we hopefully gain a wider perspective and a greater vision with regard to our temporal goods. But also, when we treat our temporal goods well in an ordered way, that actually leaves us more sensitive to the movements of the Spirit. Right? So our attachments to temporal goods can often stifle our spiritual life. And in many cases, Ignatius talks about how consolation often follows. Sometimes it precedes acts of sacrifice and courage, but a lot of times it follows acts of sacrifice and courage too, where people who divest themselves find themselves more spiritually attuned and more able to enter into prayer. And so in that sense, the two reinforce each other. Prayer helps us to have an ordered attitude towards money. An ordered attitude towards money helps us to pray. All right. All right. And one other point, before getting into the three different subheadings here, is also just to point out that Ignatius imagines that these exercises will be made by people who are in the world. Okay. So these are not rules just for monks to obey, but he imagines these are rules that people who have some possessions, have some status, have some place in the world might use to, not necessarily always to become a monk and to run off and renounce everything, but to come to some ordered middle, some ordered mean, in their life in the world. All right, so that being said, with all these introductory remarks, let me go ahead and hit number one, which is the balance to be struck. Okay. So here's a couple. You can see here, this is one of one of Ignatius's introductory rules here for thinking about how one ought to give away one's money. And you'll notice there's a couple aspects that I want to highlight. Right? First of all, he says that money is not bad in itself. Right? So there's no wrong in receiving the goods of God our Lord for distribution. Okay? And even just notice the way he puts it. Already he kind of reframes it. No wrong in receiving. So already our goods are something that we're not entitled to, but something that we've received. Okay? For distribution. And if someone is called by the Lord to such a service, then this is a good thing. And I think what he means is anybody effectively who's not a religious and hasn't renounced all his goods has received goods for distribution. That's what that's the primary purpose of them. Now, how you distribute them is a question we'll come to in a bit, or what. But then he adds the other side of the balance. But money is one of those kind of things that we tend to retain in excess, right? We tend to, it's our temptation to want to be more secure than we need to be, and to want to hold on to more than the ordered middle would dictate, or then hold on to more than somebody who really believed that God as Creator and Lord would hold on to. And so he comes back to, so this all brings us back to a theme that was very much emphasized in Christian preaching all throughout the ages up until fairly recently, which is this idea that we avoid superfluities, we avoid excess, we avoid what's beyond what we need, to live a dignified life. And in my, I think the image I'd like to use for this, you notice I put the image up here. Well, I'm sorry, moving away from the mic. The image up here is that of Ignatius being kicked out of the Holy Land, right? So this is one of the, I guess one of the Franciscans, thugs, who made sure that people who were excommunicated or threatened with excommunication actually left. And Ignatius has seen a vision of Christ being consoled by the hardships that he's experiencing, right? But this is him, at the height of his pilgrim journey. He's left Europe, he's gone to Jerusalem, he wants to live and die there, just contemplating the holy sites and so forth. And the Franciscans are afraid that he's going to get ransomed, or he'll get kidnapped, and they'll have to pay a lot of ransom, so they want him to leave. Okay, and so they kick him out of the Holy Land. But just this image of the pilgrim, I think, is a really important image for thinking about this balance, right? So in the past couple summers, I have spent a week or 2 weeks backpacking in the mountains in Wyoming. So there's a little, you might have heard about, there's this little Catholic college in Wyoming called Wyoming Catholic College, and they've got a group of outfitters that sprung up from this college, and they basically make available tents and sleeping bag and technical equipment and guides and outfitters with a lot of technical expertise, and they'll just take groups hiking. But they like to bring a priest with them so they can have mass on the trail. And so I've been that mass priest in the trail for a couple summers. Just this last summer, I was out 2 weeks straight. And when you're walking with everything that you need to survive on your back, you start to become very attentive to the weight. It's like every little thing. You start to second guess. Like, oh, maybe I should have shaved my toothbrush. I should have cut it in half to eliminate that extra half an ounce of weight. Or I should have done, because you just feel everything when you carry it around. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of stuff you wouldn't want to do without. Like if you couldn't boil water when you got to your camp at night, things would get pretty uncomfortable pretty quickly, because you go hungry and you couldn't make coffee. You couldn't do any of the things you wanted to do, and so you're always in this kind of middle ground between wanting to bring all the things you need, but nothing more than you need, and you feel both those sides of it when you're out on the trail. And it's because you're moving and because you're loaded with everything that you need to live. And I would say, this is kind of like the pilgrim life, right? This is what Ignatius experienced. He was on the move for this period of his life, and he felt very much the same tension, right? You need certain things, but at the same time, he doesn't want anything more because you have to lug it around with you. And I think that this is something like the attitude of somebody who knows that his end lies beyond this world, right? That you're a pilgrim who's moving towards heaven. And the things of this world can be useful for getting you there, just like certain things in your pack, you're not going to get very far without them, right? But at the same time, for somebody who knows that he's a pilgrim, and somebody who feels that deeply in his bones, their natural instinct is not to want to have anything more than what they need, right? To travel light, to be agile in this world, to be free, to move. And I think for Ignatius, this is a big value. And so easily what happens is that when we lose sight of the fact that we're pilgrims, that we begin to want to take on more weight, right? We just kind of want to park and camp, right? And we stay by the campsite where there's a nice little outlet where you can plug stuff in, where you can get water from the faucet, and then we just start to accumulate more stuff. Oh, maybe that extra, the extra bedroll would be good, or maybe I will bring steak in the trail and cook it, and bring it with my portable George Foreman grill, or and you start to bring all the things with you, right? And right, and this is what happens when we lose that perspective. And so there's easily what I would call this necessity creep, right? That things that we lived quite happily without for a long time all of a sudden become things we absolutely cannot live without. I just think about, in some ways this is a more complex social reality, but I think about my cell phone. Like, I lived most of my life without one of these, and now it's pretty hard to imagine life without it, right? So now I need the most up-to-date one. If it starts getting slow at all, or if the battery, doesn't last more than a couple hours, and all of a sudden I need it now, right? So what was formerly a luxury, to carry around, a computer more powerful than, anything that launched the whatever, Apollo to the moon, right? To be able to carry that around in my pocket was once this amazing thing. Now it's just like the absolute bare minimum of my life. I can't live a second without it, right? And so, but we have this general tendency once we get something to make it into a necessity. And in that sense, not to perhaps to draw the line between necessities and superfluities in the right place. And so I'll use a different metaphor, but for kind of traveling. But I think the trick, or the way I think about this, is something like marathon training. I don't know if any of you all have ever run a marathon or trained for long distance. I actually haven't, but I have a lot of friends who do, so I watch them go through the process. And one of the things that happens in marathon training is that you try to avoid both undertraining and overtraining, right? Because a marathon is a long event, and so obviously it's possible that you can just be too lazy and not put in your miles and do that sort of thing. And then when the race day comes, you're not in great shape. But it also happens that there's a certain kind of person who tends to overtrain. And what happens there is instead of running short distances, maybe just like one long run once a week, what they do is they just run long all the time. And then what happens, they start to get shin splints, their body starts to break down, and in point of fact, they're just as bad on race day as the people who undertrained. And so the idea when you're doing this kind of long distance training is sort of find the sweet spot where you're not undertraining and you're not overtraining. You're pushing yourself to the point where it's uncomfortable, but not so far that your body begins to break down. You begin to start losing things you need. One of my old Jesuit buddies was a great runner. He, in point of fact, was on scholarship at Stanford, which is a place where a lot of Olympic hopefuls come from. And he just had this very slight asymmetry. Like he had one leg just a little bit longer than the other. And he was a great high school runner. But when he moved up to the college level and tried to train at that level with this slight little, kind of defect, his body just began to break down. Like he started to have to compensate. One knee started to go. Pretty soon he just had to stop running because he reached a sort of point. And that point's different for different people, right? So for somebody who has perfectly symmetrical legs, he might be able to push themselves a little bit harder than this guy. But this guy's sort of sweet spot was just short of what he needed to really be able to do to train at Olympic levels, and so he never ended up going on, right? But that's it. So even though everybody's finding this balance, another aspect of the balance is that the balance is different for different people. Okay, depending on, just like for my friend, that sweet spot between overtraining and undertraining was different because of his particular physiology and so forth. So it's the case for each one of us because of our situation in life, our families, our health, the positions we hold. And I'll return to this point later. But this is the key, question. It's like, how do I determine where for me, the line between what's necessary and what goes and what's luxury, what superfluity is. Okay, that was the first point. Now we're going to move on to the second here. So one of the ways of coming to a better determination about necessities and superfluities is to begin informing your conscience. And for Ignatius, he gives 3 different models in these rules. Each model is a different rule. All right, so the very first one, as you can see, that he gives here is none other than Christ. Right? And whom he describes as our high priest, our model, and our God. And for Ignatius, I chose here the image of Christ washing the feet of the disciples. Christ was a man who, for Ignatius, was poor, okay, as much as he could be. But somebody who emptied himself for others. And that's one of the reasons why Ignatius thinks that when you're making a decision about how to spend your money and how to distribute your alms, that you do well to do it when you've been meditating on the mysteries of Christ's life in silence, day after day, for a couple weeks. And he thinks that by the time you've maybe done that and have just caught fire with love of Christ and admiration and internalization of his values, then maybe at that point your instincts are more trustworthy about where that line is between what's extra and what's necessary. And so this is just one of his general strategies. If we want to make decisions about how we should live and how we should spend, then we do well to do it in the atmosphere of a retreat, when we're warm with zeal and fervor for Christ, and particularly sensitive to his way of looking at the world. All right, the second model of the three for informing conscience is this. He has St. Augustine. And you can see here, this is one of the rules for discernment, for the distribution of alms. And he cites actually the Third Council of Carthage, which is one of the early councils of the church, which decreed that the furniture of a bishop should be cheap and poor. But he also, and we've already seen this emphasis in his emphasis on Christ, the self-emptying one. But he also adds this other thing here, and something I alluded to a little bit earlier, about how there's a need to adapt this preferential option for austerity, to adapt it to each one's condition and rank. Okay, and so of course in Ignatius's day there was a much more stratified society. You had bishops and princes and nobles, and there were certain expectations for each of these levels of society. You wore certain kinds of clothes to befit your office. And these clothes were almost considered not so much private goods as like public goods. They're the ways in which the people see the dignity of their country in the way that their king is dressed, or in the way that so forth. Right, and so he thought that was fine, that there's different ways of following this counsel, or of being poor, depending on the state of life you're in. G.K. Chesterton used to say that in the medieval world, the bishop would wear silks on the outside and a hair shirt underneath. In the modern world, we wear the hair shirt on the outside and the silks underneath. We like to be comfortable but look like we're just sort of, the average Joe, right? But this is so there's a very different sense of these things. But I think this is something what he's getting at. But what it means is that also, even though we don't have quite the same kind of stratified society with nobles and different estates, what we do have are still different jobs, different family sizes, different whatever. So, for instance, my brother is an architect, and he's sort of in the image business. Like he has to, when he goes and meets clients, he can't look like a slob or he can't look too unstylish, because if he does, then clients will look at him and think, this guy will not know how to make my house look good, right? And so he has to, he has to be well dressed and somewhat fashionable, okay? And this is almost like a business expense for him, right? It's just part of his thing, right? And so he probably his clothing budget is probably gonna be a little bit bigger, because of his job, than if he were, in some other profession. You can name whatever you want. All right, but there are differences in the way that we spend and what ends up being necessary for us because of those things. At the same time, I do remember, I remember one time being really struck when I was young, like 20 years old. A friend of our family was the head of neurosurgery for Westchester County up in New York. He was an Opus Dei numerary, very nice guy. Offered to take me out for dinner or something like that. So, but I remember, he picked me up in kind of a pretty beat up Mercury Sable. And I remember thinking, okay, this guy, he chooses this. This is not the car that he needs to buy. This is the car he wants to buy. But I just remember being very edified by that, and he doesn't need, part of his job is not having a flashy car so that he can show it to his clients. They never see his car, so that's not where he invested his money. All right, let's keep on going here.
Father, I can see just as a quick example, attorneys practicing in court, for instance, are not going to walk into court dressed in, commoner's clothes. Number one, the judge will kick you out. And number two, your client will think, I'm doomed.
Yep.
So you have to, the attorneys walk into the courtroom, they have to dress the part.
No, I think that's right. Yeah, and so I think these are the kind of things you have to take into account. So that's why I think this idea of measuring it according to state of life is always important. It needs to be done. All All right, so our third one here is now moving to married couples. And the major thing that I want to point out here is just that he talks about how married couples might divide their spending into 3 different categories. Now, of course, he says a third, a third, a third. I don't expect that everybody who's, faithful to the gospel will actually be living off only a third of their income. But just to notice what he says, would be the typical places somebody would give their money in addition to supporting their own family. And so number 1 is, of course, the poor. But the second one is he says the temple, right? And this is part of the old legends of the life of Joachim and Anne, the mother of, or the parents of Mary. And I really want to focus on this idea of the temple, right? Because sometimes we can even be a little bit materialist in our way of being anti-materialist, right? So when we want to give money away, the thing we think of is just meeting basic human necessities, right? That's how we're going to do it. We're going to give money so that people have drinking water, or so they have enough food or shelter or things like that. And all that's certainly good, and obviously Ignatius would not want to discourage people from doing that. But it doesn't need to be the only place that we would support with our charity. Because I think in previous ages, even more than ours, they were very sensitive to the fact that man is more than the body, right? And that he also has intellectual and spiritual needs. And so therefore, the way that we help the poor, or our fellow man, whoever it might be, is not only meeting their basic needs, but also meeting their intellectual and spiritual needs, getting them educated, helping them be edified. So I'll just give, there's a lot of different examples here, but one story that was told to me by a guy who is pretty well informed, so I trust him, is about, or that I think illustrates this point, is that of St. Catherine Ann Drexel. I don't know if any of y'all have heard of her. She was kind of an heiress, lived in Philadelphia, convert to Catholicism. She had, in her day, in the mid-19th century, a fortune of many millions of dollars, which in today's money would probably be, hundreds of millions of dollars. And she was the heiress to this fortune, and then she ended up deciding to become a Catholic nun. And she founded her own order, which is centered up in Philadelphia. I think it's the, I'm trying to remember exactly what they're called right now, but I know they founded the Xavier University in New Orleans, which is just down the road from the high school where I used to teach. But she had the strategy. She worked mostly with Native Americans and with blacks to kind of help evangelize them, to help improve their lives in various ways. And her strategy was this: she would always, when she moved into a neighborhood that was poor, her first step was not to open up a soup kitchen, but her first thing that she would actually do was to build a beautiful church, and for that community, beautiful Catholic church with all the gilding, all the marble, etc. And when asked why she would do that, she said, "It's important that the people I work with know that their souls are just as important as the souls of white people." And the way that she showed this is by building them a church as beautiful as the church the white people had. Okay? And so there's this way in which they were dignified, even though it didn't necessarily, keep them warm or well-fed. At least in the first instance, it let them know who they were, and was also a sign to them of what was important. Sometimes there can be this sort of, this kind of materialistic charity where we assume that the poor don't have spiritual needs, right? And that's part of our own kind of materialist prejudices projecting onto them, that they certainly couldn't be thinking about things of the moral life or the spirit until they were well provided for and secure, right? But most of humanity has lived without a lot of security and without a lot of food, and they've always had, spiritual inclinations and yearnings, right? And it's important to respect that as well. St. Francis de Sales used to, in his examination of conscience at the end of Introduction to the Devout Life, he would have a little section on questions on what have I done for the glory of God. and of course many things you can do for the glory of God, but one of the things that he would list there for, what have I done for the glory of God, is have I made anything in the service of the church more beautiful? Right? Because of this idea that, that there's this kind of scale, in that our values end up being inevitably reflected in our culture, and our architecture, and our institutions, right? So when our there's a building on Harvard's campus called Memorial Hall. That's like the most beautiful building on campus. It's this huge Gothic brick thing, and it's actually the dining hall, and pretty much everything else is at a much humbler scale, right? But that says something, in the architecture about what the priorities of the school are, and there's a way in which what we invest in, what we make beautiful, this communicates at a cultural level what we actually think is important, right? And so by making things beautiful, by investing in them, by having beautiful art, for instance, in our churches, right? We do. There's a kind of evangelization that goes on. In my hometown of Augusta, the prettiest building was an old Jesuit church, an old brick church called Sacred Heart. And even though the Jesuits had left it 20 years before, I started thinking about it, it always made me curious. I was like, I wonder who these people are, that built basically the most beautiful building in my town, and what they stood for. And those questions were raised in my mind because they left this monument there. And I thought, well, whoever built that must have been serious about what they were doing. And it communicated something. All right. So this tells us both how to spend, but also what to keep too.
Much more. I visited Cuba quite a bit in the last few years, and the story I heard a lot was about young people that had no idea about Catholicism, had not been, brought up by anybody, so maybe their grandmother would talk to them about praying or something. But when, for some reason, on some occasion, they had the opportunity to enter into a church, they could see the difference between the cleanliness, the order, the beauty of that, and as soon as they turned their head and looked outside again, it was like, what is this? And they credit that for their coming back to the church.
Amazing.
I hear a lot.
No, I think it's. They communicate something. There's no doubt they communicate a worldview, and these little, it's like a prayer in stone or something that people can participate in. So, yeah, I know of other people who, like the Basilica at Notre Dame's campus where I did my doctorate was built. I mean, it's beautiful. It's just got this sort of nice collegiate neo-Gothic. But it was built by the nickels and dimes of Irish immigrants who had nothing, but they wanted something beautiful because they were proud of their faith. And I know of people who, who've just done tours of this building and just heard about the sacrifices they made in order to build it, and that, kind of awakened them to the faith. They were like, this must be real, and they just saw that there was a view of eternity there too, that they knew they would never see this completed in their lifetime, many of the people who were contributing to it. But they assumed the church would always be there, and that their children and grandchildren could worship in this place. And it just communicated the sense of the solidity of the faith, that the church was indefectible and that the faith would never die. And but all these things are communicated implicitly in these in our architecture, but also in any other kind of artistic achievement. I'll give one more example on this point, which is just, not just how much to give, but also to think about what to keep too. And when we keep money for our own, the maintenance of our own households and our own lifestyle and so forth, there should be a preferential option too for the intellectual and spiritual parts of ourself. Okay, so it's spending a lot of money on creature comforts is a somewhat different category than spending a lot of money on, being able to make an annual retreat, or being able to stay educated about the faith and maintain a library that helps nourish me in this way, or whatever it might be. So there's somewhat different so I would say that the tradition has generally been less suspicious of spending in ways that support the kind of intellectual and spiritual formation of people. So St. Thomas More, for instance, lawyer and Chancellor of England, and he himself lived very austerely, fasted, kept vigil at night, wore a hair shirt, but he would spend a lot of money on the education of his kids. He hired private tutors for them, and he even did things like he actually assembled a zoo on his own property, and he brought exotic animals from different parts of the world because he wanted his kids, but also all the people who were part of his extended household, to be filled with wonder at the beauty of creation. And he just thought that this was a way of awakening them to that, to see these animals, do these things. Right? So these were not things that made his life more comfortable, to have these noisy animals around, but they were things that he thought helped fill people with wonder and awe. All right? And so things that help us do that, I think, is also another criterion for thinking, okay, what do I keep versus what do I spend? And things we keep for those purposes, for spiritual and intellectual purposes, are a little more permissible, I would say, in the grand scheme. All right. Now we're going to move to Ignatius actually gives 3 scenarios to hone discernment, but I'm just going to give you 2 of them here. All right. So Ignatius has given us some general principles. He's given us a balance to be struck. All right, and now he's going to give us a couple imaginative exercises for helping us in the moment come up with a good balance and strike it in accordance with the gospel's values and with Jesus' own vision. The first one is this. He has you imagine advising a stranger. So you can read it up here. Right? That basically what you do is you imagine somebody coming to you who's more or less in your position, and they protest. Look, no matter what it costs me, I don't care if it makes me uncomfortable, I don't care, whatever. All I want to do is I want to follow God's will. And so what should I do? Should I keep this or should I let it go? Should I, give my money away to this charity, or should I invest it in my retirement fund? Whatever it might be. All right? And he says that you should imagine how you would advise this person. And then whatever rule that you would give them, keep yourself. Okay? So this is just a strategy for getting a little bit of distance, right, from our own situation. Like a lot of times, we're just attached to our stuff. We don't even really want to let our mind wander down that path because we're like, oh, if I start thinking about this too much, I'm probably going to have to give this up. So you just stop thinking about it, right? And so this is one of the strategies for neutralizing that resistance, or that way in which our attachments tend to dictate our train of thought, by imagining somebody else doing this, who doesn't, and you don't have nearly the skin in the game of this guy's decision that you do in your own decision. So you just kind of imagine how you'd advise that guy. All right, but by getting that objective distance, you can then return to it and say, okay, let me follow the rule I would have given him. All right, and that's just a way of trying to move back to objectivity. Okay, so there's one. Here's the next one. This is my favorite cartoons from the New Yorker. But this is, I should picture myself at the hour of my death, right? And then I will, ponder how I wish I had lived, or how I think at that moment I will have wished that I had lived. All right, and then I will keep that rule now. All right, and this is one of the, he also has another one. He has a third rule. It's about judgment. It's kind of the same idea. Thinking of when, what would you be happier offering to Christ at judgment, in terms of the way you spent your money? Or what would you be happier to have done when you meet your death? Looking back on it, what would be the better way for you to have lived? And he thinks that we should just meditate on this, and before doing big financial decisions of this sort, just to kind of to enter into that big scheme and think about it from that big perspective. And I think so just a couple points about these exercises. The first one is that this is actually the kind of thing that's, a somewhat different exercise, but this is becoming the way of like decluttering. You know, there's all these decluttering gurus out there that help you simplify your life. And one of my sister-in-laws, is kind of like a mentor to other mothers. And she, tries to help them declutter, do things. And I was actually looking at one of the books that she was reading, and it was something on like, how to reduce and simplify and relax. And at the end, it had a series of kind of like spiritual exercises for going through your stuff. And I remember one of the ones that stands out in my mind because it was so vivid was what they called the dog vomit test. So what you should do is you should take all the stuff in your house. You should imagine that a dog has vomited over all of it. And then you should think, which of my things would I actually bother to clean off? And whatever you wouldn't bother to clean off, throw it away now, right? That was the dog vomit test. But the idea is that you use the power of your imagination, think about the weight of these things, and sort of use it as a criterion for distinguishing between the essentials and the inessentials, right? And this is a similar kind of imaginative test, but obviously with a more religious valence to it, right? Think about what I would be happy to have done with my money, meeting Christ at judgment or on my deathbed, and to keep that rule now. And these have power. And of course, the early commentators on the exercise used to point out the fact that this was actually a discerning use of the gift of fear that I mentioned in the homily, right? That you think about judgment, you think about death, think about these things, and let the power that holy fear has, right, to want to both please God and avoid punishment and all those things, to let that clarify your mind and to let it guide and strengthen your resolution, guide your thoughts. Okay. Well, I think that is actually, we're coming to the end of the talk here. But yeah, what would I want to just say in summary? I think if you look at this overall, you can see that embedded in these very practical rules is a profound spirituality of the use of things of this world, okay, temporal goods. And for Ignatius, what do I want to say? That he wanted us to be able to serve God in all things. And all things means all things. Right? So that means that our service to Him must descend to the very concrete levels of the way that our households run, the way that our monthly budgets look, the way that we, just the way that we live, we spend, we manage our households, all these things. And that when it descends to that level, then that's a sign that conversion has really taken hold in us. And this is one of his ways of just, sort of a litmus test or a diagnostic for helping us think. Like, how much has the gospel and its own attitude towards money taken root in me? And if it hasn't, then we can maybe just look at a couple of these things here and just resolve, to take one more step towards that goal. Just to do one concrete thing to advance along the path of Christ. And if this talk helps any of y'all to do that, I'll be very pleased. Thank you. I don't know what normally are there questions that normally follow? Go ahead.
Kind of an odd question.
The mic.
Good, give me the mic. Odd question. I asked Eric if he knew what a hair shirt was. And he said no. I thought maybe it was a generational thing, but I wasn't aware of it. What is a hair shirt?
A hair shirt is it's basically a device of penance. So they'd wear this undershirt that was woven out of coarse hair, and it bothered them throughout the day. It was kind of itchy and uncomfortable. And so it's just a mild form of penance that always kind of reminds you of the cross throughout the day. And that's it. So they would wear that underneath their silks and robes and so forth. So
Like a burlap or a...
something like that, yeah.
Like horses hair.
Like, yeah, it could be. So I think, right. Something like that. So it was coarse fabric that you didn't want to be wearing normally against the skin, but they did wear against the skin in this case. So,
Father, working back to the traveling light idea, is it related to the passage in the gospel when Christ sends his disciples with only one tunic and only one of each kind? And is that the spirit?
I think it's. I think that certainly fits the model, right? That Christ wanted his disciples to go out, and he wanted them to preach in poverty and have an experience of dependence, right? So he didn't want them to be overly secure on the road, and I think that's certainly part of it. Now, as to whether he told them to to travel more lightly so they can move faster, I'm not sure about that. I get the impression that the emphasis for him was more that they had the experience of depending upon God's providence and seeing that, God, in point of fact, doesn't let those down who trust in him, even materially. So even nowadays, Jesuit novices still do a similar exercise. They're sent out with a one-way bus ticket to some place, and are told to find some useful employment, in service to the church for a month, and then to beg their way back. And so they can. A lot of them end up in a homeless shelter or in some other place, and they just kind of, they sort of rely on God for a month and meet people. And when you meet people, you can inform them of your situation. Well, I'm only a couple days from needing somehow to get back to my novitiate, but I don't have any money. And so you can accept, collections and donations, but that's the idea, is you go out not having what you need to get back or to survive for the next month, and you trust that God will open up a way for you. So this kind of thing does still happen.
There was an aspect of going fast, because Jesus said, don't greet anybody on the way.
Yeah.
Because the Oriental greeting took a lot of time. They have to eat and everything. So they want to go straight to your work. Don't be distracted with greeting people around.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds right. So I don't think I have too much more to say about that, except that this idea of greeting was not simply saying hi, but it was sort of, it was a way of renewing, your acquaintance with all of the people who could help you, so that you didn't have to rely on God. So I think that's another part of it too, is, you go along the way and then you kind of get all your friends and relatives to supply you, to give you provisions, and so.
Sorry, my last question. The origin of all evil is the love of money. That's what Paul says in St. Timothy's letter. Uh-huh. The love of money is the origin of all evil. That's a tremendous statement. With Ignatius endorsed that, I suppose. The origin of all evil is the love of money.
Yeah.
Not money, but the love of money.
The love of money. Yeah. So I would say, Ignatius is a little bit more moderate, right? So as you point out, there's this disordered attachment is certainly a big problem for Ignatius. But he's, put it this way, I would say that there's a kind of genesis that Ignatius thinks of in terms of money. It's like, for instance, in the two standards, if y'all remember that meditation, right? It's always riches, honors, pride. Is always the sequence, right? Which kind of suggests that there's a certain beginning with money. But one of the reasons why it's easy to begin with money and then move down this road to honors and pride, and of course pride's not good for anybody, right? Is that money actually can have good uses. So it's subtler, right? So in the sense that it's easier for that to worm its way into the heart, even of a good person, because everybody has to deal with some money, right? So you can't exclude it from your life entirely, and there are good uses for it. And so everybody's got to have it in some sense. Whereas there's other things you could just exclude from your life altogether, right? In that sense, it would be it's less subtle, right? But once you begin with money and then you have it, then it's easy to become attached to it. And then once you do have a lot of it, then it's easy to notice that people honor you for it. And then it's easy to notice. And then once people honor you, then it's easy to believe all the things that they say about you. and then you're proud. And so there's kind of a slippery slope that begins with money. So this idea of being the love of money being the root of evil, this idea of the root in the sense of the beginning, the place where it gets an entry, I think is doesn't necessarily mean it's the worst sin, but it might be the sort of entry point.
Finally.
Okay.
So, because you have so many ideas. This idea of, I heard the life of a lady saint was married to a king or something, and she was very saintly, and she wanted to get rid of all the jewels.
Uh-huh.
And the king said, no, you have to appear in the front of the people as what you are.
Yeah.
And she took it back, all the jewels that she had.
Yeah.
She had to keep her status for the people.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm not sure which saint that is, but that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, that's, certainly you could find, kings and so forth who did not divest themselves of all their crowns and jewels precisely because they saw these as being public goods or common goods. There's a distinction in the Christian tradition between private goods and common goods. And common goods are basically the kind of goods that can be shared without being diminished. So like a private good is like beachfront property, right? Every time somebody gets more, other people have less, right? And so it's competitive that way. Whereas a good like truth, knowledge, even beauty in a church, something like that, these are things that more and more people can share in them without competition. Like the fact that I know this doesn't mean that you don't know it. The fact that I share in this beauty doesn't mean that you can't share in it, right? And so, and I would say those kind of kingly, that kind of regal splendor was closer to something like a common good because the whole nation felt themselves dignified by it. That they could see the importance of their country and of their tradition in the way the king was dressed. And so I'd say that for that reason, they tended to give more leeway to that kind of expenditure because it wasn't actually, giving that much pleasure to the king. I'm sure these things were probably heavy and cumbersome and so forth, but what they was giving pleasures to the people. So I think there's something to be said for that.
I think that's interesting, and now in living in a world where we don't have such, there's kings and princes and all of
Right.
that, how in our culture now, our current culture, if there's still vestiges of that, with the White House or things of that nature, vestiges of, or even Russia and their palaces and things to understand that where this comes from. So I think it's a really good principle. And I also want to say, as a father raising kids, it's so great to hear these principles because we have an answer to the principle of instant gratification. Right? So instead of saying, do I need this now? What's the principle I'm going to apply? Well, what's going to make me happy right now? As opposed to, wait a minute, let's think about this using the principles of Ignatius. I'm on my deathbed, or somebody's coming to me and asking for something similar, using a different principle as opposed to, well, this is going to make me happy right now, so I'm going to do it. So it's important for me, as a father, understanding the answer to that principle.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I think that's a good, I think just as a general principle, the idea that before we do any major kind of financial thing, there should be some prayerful discussion with God before this, where we think about, okay, like is this the right thing to do in light of eternity? So.
I think your presentation was excellent, so thank you very much. It made me think while we were going through the presentation that it's very difficult to make a decision as to what is fair to be kept. As you get older, you need less.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have your kids, your grandkids, other people who are taking part of their money, all that stuff. And it's a very difficult decision to make as to how much you should keep to be able to pass on. That will be kind of difficult to handle in a situation when you have a bunch of kids and grandkids.
He forgot the Internal Revenue Service.
So part of the issue also is that part of the money at that time was to give because there was no government. There was no government taking away from you money to give away. that is a remnant, I hope, from the Christianity that we have in our countries nowadays. The way back was going to the king, and the king, if he was nice, he would help some of the poor. Otherwise, there was no official system to try to help some.
Yeah, it's so true. Around the time of Ignatius, that's when they started to develop these systems. But it's true that in Spain and a lot of Catholic countries, they resisted having centralized bureaucracies for taking care of the poor, precisely because they saw the merit, the reward that they can get in heaven from giving the money to the poor. So it was so embedded in their culture that this is one of the ways in which one glorifies God and receives heavenly reward. It knows only through giving to the poor. That they didn't want that taken away from them by these government agencies. So I think there is, you might say, some, so maybe the third sort of breakdown might not be the one that people can do nowadays. But the fact of the matter remains that that there's always a place for, how would I say, more individualized charity. Even beyond all these government agencies. That's one of the things that I think Pope Benedict XVI really argued for in his Caritas and Veritas project. This idea that justice, there's always going to have to be something additional to justice. There's always going to have to be a personal face put on charity, where you don't just give goods, but you actually have a personal encounter with the poor, do these sort of things. And so I think to the extent that still is an irreplaceable element that no amount of government thing can do, then there's still going to be a place for having some of your income and some of your time, to the extent that you're able to, dedicated to that as a really as a key part of the Christian life. So,
Well, I have an answer for Sedgwick. And it's my own life example. And so your question is a great lead up to what I wanted to say and share. I have to start by saying that I had no idea what a vocation was until I joined the opera at 55. Honest to God. I did vocation. What does that mean? I knew I had to have a family and be a provider.
Yep.
The idea of choosing between a religious life and that was never something that I considered. I was not exposed to it. But I did begin, thanks to my wife, begin my path back to Christ at the age of 40. Sometime soon after that, still early in my walk back, because I was grew up Catholic, of course. I read a book, a secular book, but it's a good approximation to the first answer to what you're answering, your concern. And basically, the book was titled "Die Broke." And I read that book, and it impressed me. And in fact, I followed that guideline. And it said, I guess it's a first approximation. It's the answer to the rich man. How much do you really need? How much do you have to? So he basically said, at some point, you decide that what you have to decide. What do you need to live? To live from now on in time. Which means you have to, you have to work on things like annuities, things that will not end as long as you're alive.
Right.
So so you cover the upside in case you live to be 100, which I expect to be. No, it's from my genes, my family genes. So I'm going to get my Social Security money back for sure.
Good.
For sure, God willing. But basically, the point is, at some point you say, what do I need to live on? And then because you have to make a judgment decision. That's where the Christianity comes in. On what level of sanctification, level of living are you going to have? And then whatever money's left over, give it away now. Don't wait till you die and then have your kids. I only have one, so I won't have that issue either. But have your kids and your family fight and break up because of who's going to get what money from dad and mom, which is a crazy thing that happens in society all the time.
All the time, yeah.
So the idea is, at some point you put yourself on a budget for the rest of your life.
Yep.
And likely as you're going to get poor each time, and that's okay. That's a good exercise. And the other part is give that money away now. That's it. Be done with it. It's over. And I followed that. I have to confess. at the age of, since I didn't have a vocation, I didn't have particular, I loved my work always, but I didn't really have I didn't need to keep working. I didn't have, you know. So at 55, I called it quits. And I'm 72, and the plan is still working pretty good. So that's that advice, and I followed that advice. And I say it works for me.
Yeah. Well, it's good. And I think that's, I think the key thing in all this is, I mean, obviously making that decision with gospel principles in mind, but then also just watching for, I suppose, the creep, you know, I mean, this might not apply to everybody here, but, you know, there's just a general sense that, you know, every time I get a promotion and get a pay raise, you know, there's kind of like a lifestyle upgrade, right? You know, so when I get when I get the next pay scale upgrade, then I get all the accessories that go with it, right? I get the next car level up, I get the next house level up, I get the next wardrobe level up, right? And you just sort of, you know, so we still have our own kind of hierarchy, you know, it's not quite as well defined as in the Middle Ages, but the point is to kind of get out of that mentality. I think that's it, where it's not where the way I spend my money isn't dictated by just moving up, you know, the hierarchy of pay scales and lifestyles, but it's based on like, what do I need to live a dignified life as understood by the gospel's principles? And then when more comes to me, that instead of keeping more, I just, you know, give more away.
Just real quick, the distinction there is the public good, right? That lifestyle, well, I got promotion, I move up. Those are not public goods, right?
Right, exactly. Whereas, you know, if you got your first job at a law firm out of college and then you needed to, whatever, get the wardrobe and the thing that went with it, then okay, then that's, but you know, if you're just getting a pay raise for doing the same job, there's no reason for you to be getting always the next level suit up just because you have more money to do it with.
What does the church teach about what we should be giving?
Well, this is the problem. It doesn't have any very clear. It teaches that, I mean, one of the precepts of the church is that you should be, you know, supporting the church's work and the care of the poor and that kind of thing. So that's among the precepts of the church. But it doesn't give a percentage, you know, like in the Old Testament you had a tithe. The church doesn't teach that you have to tithe, you don't give a tenth anymore in that sense. So,
But in Spanish it's called diezmo, which means 10%.
well, in English a tithe also means a tenth, but it's not. But it's just sort of a holdover from the Old Testament. It doesn't really. But
Let me make a comment.
Go for it.
I like your presentation very much. One of the advantages of getting old is that you can test whether what's in Ignatius is saying works or not.
Okay.
And I can tell you that it does. I have used that image of being in the deathbed with white hair that I know had and I didn't have when I made the decision. And looking back, I can tell you it works. So for the young guys here, it works. But I have the following question, especially because of today's gospel, where Christ said, don't let your right hand know what your left hand is doing or your left hand what your right hand is doing. And yet, I look at Belen. And when I look at Belen, I see names tagged to different buildings and different persons. So the question is, how do you reconcile that?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I don't know whether I don't know exactly what goes in the negotiation of these kind of things. So for instance, you know, I think that somebody's making the name a condition for their giving would probably go against the gospel principle. But I think if somebody's minded to give and then the school out of gratitude decides that they want to honor this person by naming, then I don't think that necessarily goes against the gospel principle. So in as much as gratitude is a good thing. And
let me take that concept or that question to a different direction. And I know this is a little off topic, but the gospel, you know, and again, I think you summarized the concept there. And one of the things that we've been discussing a lot with those that were trained within the Educación is the commitment to apostolado, to the apostolate, right? To the various apostolates that one can do within one life, including what's coming out from the preferences, the documents of the Second Vatican Council on the apostolates. And one of the things that's been a little bit of a challenge is the discernment between not letting your left hand and right hand and so on and so forth, and trying to be discreet in one's work for God and contributions of the kingdom. And on the other hand, fulfilling the call that exists within the church's teaching of the apostolate to be an example.
Yeah.
And it's hard to be an example when you're trying to be discreet. And yet you don't want to not be discreet, because that's what the gospel encourages to do. So, and again, I know it's a little bit far off, but charity has to do with that as well. You know, what you give and so on is an example to others. So these could be examples of people showing the community what a gift can do for the school, as an example.
You have to be the light of the world, so that's
the bushel, the light, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, and that's always the question, that they may see the good that you do and give glory not to you but to God. So this is so the question is how to do it in such a way where you don't become the stopping point of the gaze, but that it passes through you and through God. So
the intent of the person, I suppose. I mean, you do it for the love of God. You're not going to do it because you're going to get to the front page of the New York Times.
Right. Yeah, no, it's a big, there's a lot of, so just like with money itself, you can do good with it, it can also be an attachment for you. And the same thing can go for your name. So Ignatius lived in a time when people's reputation was a very big public concern. And Ignatius used to emphasize a lot that your name is not just your good, it's a public good in a certain sense, because you can influence people through it, right? And so, and so there's this way in which you're being known as an upstanding person and so forth. It can do a lot of good for the kingdom, if you're known as an outstanding professional in your life and somebody who's also a believing Catholic, or you're known as this, So, so I think that kind of, that sort of ambiguity of being able to say that, yes, this has some value, but it's not the ultimate value. It sort of follows the same pattern as the use of money. It has some value, you can do some good things with it, but
it requires that balance.
But it requires that balance, and it requires, noticing where you're so attached to your name or your money or whatnot that you're not willing to, you're not willing to sacrifice, you hold it too closely, even when it's no longer being preserved for the service of some greater good. So.
Oh, so I have another question. I stay thinking on what you said. Well, on the one hand, there's the example given by the bishops, right? That the bishop should have cheap furniture, whatever else. And then there's also the saint who was told, or the saint, the woman, whatever, told keep your jewels because it's the status thing, right? So the lesson I kind of see there is that it needs to, what you decide to keep needs to extend beyond yourself, right? In a certain sense. There's a further purpose. And the way that you summarized it was the creature comfort versus, I don't know what other...
Right. Yeah, the kind of spiritual, intellectual goods that you might be able to...
Right. So, in a certain sense, you could take that line of thought into an extremely austere situation, right? Mm-hmm. And that seems like it's not necessarily the best thing, and that part of it is what you said at the beginning is the balance, right? So I guess, so we've talked a lot about in the suppression of the balance, right? In the suppression of the creed. What argument do we have for helping the balance?
In other words, for signs that you might be spending too little on yourself and that you might need to. So
for example, one of the things I've been looking forward to my entire life is, well, for me, I want to have a jacuzzi in my house.
I can see I struck a nerve with the creature comforts. Okay, well.
The jacuzzi obviously feels great, right? But on the other hand, it does serve a further purpose in a smaller circle than a public good, because in the day-to-day thing, it'll be something that where I know I'm going to be able to hang out with my friends, or I'm going to be able to hang out with my family, we'll be able to talk at special moments. And there it's serving a purpose towards God, I would argue, that is in furthering the community, furthering the love and the engagement, and a jacuzzi becomes a good thing.
No, so I think this is why it all ends up being kind of slippery, right? Because you can take almost anything, whatever, my. I don't really need this Lamborghini, but I know it'd be easier to have quality time with my son if I had one, because he'd want to come for rides, and it's hard to get him off his phone otherwise, so this is the way I'll do. I'll buy a Lamborghini so I can have quality. You can always come up with something that you can use it for that would be some. And so I think it's a matter of kind of looking at. One test you can think about is is this the only way that I can accomplish these other goods, And so if there's other ways of maintaining relationships with friends, there's other ways of kind of relaxing, because recreation is a legitimate human good too. We need to have an ability to relax, to be able to be with friends. Friendship is, for Aquinas and Aristotle, it's a key element of the moral life. You can't become virtuous unless you have friends. That. And Christ would say the same. So there's this whole, so those are all, so having places to meet them and have the kind of virtuous activities that friends share together and so forth. Okay, so yeah, you need to have that. But the question is a jacuzzi the only place for that to happen? Even though that could contribute to it, is it the only thing that's gonna, or is it an indispensable element, or are there other ways that are more in conformity with a gospel lifestyle, let's say? So.
But so then, how do you make that distinction then? Because let's say, if I'm rich enough where I can make a giant pool jacuzzi, and then me getting a simple jacuzzi, that becomes then, it's not a big deal, right? In a certain sense, that's a restraint.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So it's just a matter of, this is one of the places where it just gets discernment. This is why he was asking, what's the church's teaching? Well, the fact is that the church doesn't have any particular teaching on it. It has the teaching that you should avoid excessive things, and it gives you some tests for thinking about it, what's excessive. But there's no Vatican directive that says, if the diagonal on your TV is bigger than this many inches, you've gone off the deep end, right? Because, whatever, there's just different needs and different cultures and different, and maybe the guy who doesn't see very well needs a big TV, I don't know, but, it's just, but there's differences between people. And so you kind of have to look and see. I think different people like to relax in different ways. So for instance, if I think it would be fine, for instance, if you were okay, this is the one thing I'm going to do and the way I'm going to entertain my family, my friends, or something like that, and I'm not going to, opt for the luxurious vacation, and I'm not going to opt for the party yacht, I'm not going to opt for, I'm going to do this, okay? And if you kind of, if you pick your one way of doing it and you get one nice thing, okay, I think that is an example of being restrained, right? But it would be, but I think it's sort of a pick and choose kind of thing, and you have to pick and choose based on, your own kind of, personality, the region, the country you're in, just whatever. Your family size, all these different things that are distinctive to you. But the point, I think, is to be doing. I think for him it's it's like a holy kind of minimalism, right? That you're doing as little as you can in order to be able to do the good things that you are called to do in life, and that if you can. If you can do it with a little jacuzzi, then you don't need the big one, right? Or if you can do it without a jacuzzi at all, then maybe do it without a jacuzzi at all. So.
Depends on how many people you want to influence at the same time.
Right. So. Good.